Hi guys, and welcome back to Q on Cars. Now, one of the questions I get asked quite a lot is, what do I think is a fairly cheap sports car that you could buy for reasonable money and keep going for reasonable money without spending too much? And it would be rather a hypocritical thing to do if I didn't say do as I do, because I've got a very cheap sports car that has cost me pretty much nothing to keep running for the last 3 years. This is my 2003 BMW Z4. It has an M54 B30 3-litre straight-six engine, an absolutely fantastic engine. It was replaced in 2006 when they facelifted the Z4 with the N52 series straight-six engine, which was great because it had more power and was slightly more responsive, etc., etc. But it wasn't quite as reliable as the M54, and that's exactly why I chose to go with this. Still got plenty of poke for this car because it doesn't weigh very much. It's quite a lightweight car, and it's a hell of a lot of fun to drive considering what this thing actually cost me. In fact, I bought this because after browsing the classifieds for a couple of weeks, I figured out that I could buy one of these with lower mileage for less money than a Mazda MX-5. So let's take this thing out and see if I made any mistakes along the way. As with any low-slung sports car, getting in and out of the Z4 can be a little bit tricky. But luckily it's made a bit easier by the fact that the doors are really long, they open nice and wide, and the hinges have been designed in such a way that you can still open them a fair way even in a tight parking spot. So here we are, guys, in my cheap sports car, and I have to say, in the couple of years I've owned this thing, I've had a riot of a time driving this around. As you can probably tell, mine is not exactly 100% standard. It is basically stock, but I have changed one critical thing. This car has the world famous by now back box delete on it. So there's no back box on this exhaust, which means it breathes easier, it sounds fantastic. On a road like this, it's really difficult to hold back and not just put your foot down, have some fun with it, and let's be honest, irritate the locals. First off, you have to give it to Chris Bangle. I mean, at the time, he was heavily criticized for the work he was doing at BMW, and a lot of people didn't like his designs when they first came to light. But I like to think that the Z4 is sort of the one that he got right, because this car, even today, almost 20 years later, this car still looks fresh, and it looks fantastic. It's got sharp lines, it's got that beautiful long sloped bonnet. It really is a good-looking car, even today, 20 years after it first came out. The Z4 really used Bangle's flame surfacing to perfection down the sides. And unlike the 6 Series and 7 Series of the era with the Bangle butt, the back end on the Z4 is one of the best-looking rear ends ever. Not to mention the fact that these days there are very few cars around that are 20 years old and still look as good and as fresh as this does. This design has not aged a single day since the first day we saw it. The interior, likewise, is something that was criticized a lot at the time because it did away with BMW's traditional tilting of everything towards the driver. Now, although I did like that about BMWs, it's certainly not a deal breaker for me that they stopped doing it. And in this car, with its clean look on the dashboard, I have to say I kind of get why they did it. This looks much cleaner, it's a lot more symmetrical, and as much as I hate to sound like the corporate arse, for practical reasons and manufacturing purposes, this is a hell of a lot cheaper to do, because you don't have to make two different molds and two different dashboards for left-hand and right-hand drive markets. You could just use the same dashboard for both cars and have an instrument binnacle that bolts across onto the other side. In terms of interior appointments, this car has everything that you need, but not a hell of a lot else. And although a lot of people will say, well, if you're driving a BMW, you want to have all the toys, surely. Well, yes and no, because in a sports car, I actually prefer it to be a little bit more simple. I don't want things that are going to distract me from the one thing that this car is all about, which is driving. That's why you buy a sports car. It's because you want to have fun driving the thing. And this is a lot of fun. So, one of the things that you'll notice straight away as you drive along in this car is that it is quite a stiff ride. So even though the ride is quite stiff on this car, it never really becomes uncomfortable. It's still got that element of refinement to it. But the reason it has to be that stiff is because this car is all about handling. And I have to say that BMW have got that dead right with this car, because it is comfortable enough to drive on a daily basis, and yet the body control on this car is second to none. There's almost no roll in the corners. Grip levels really are very high, and I can very honestly report that this car will hold on and grip long after I've run out of bravery. If you do push it that little bit too far, the car is actually remarkably forgiving. Obviously, it's got traction control that has two different settings. In either mode, you really have to do something spectacularly stupid to get this car completely out of shape. The only thing that dynamically I can fault with this car is the steering, which was one of BMW's first forays into electric power steering. And that's not to say that it's terrible. I've certainly driven a lot of cars that are a hell of a lot worse than this, but it is just that little bit numb. It doesn't give you quite the feedback that you would expect a driver's car to give you. I want to enjoy this engine. As you can hear, with that open exhaust, this thing really sings. I mean, it sounds bloody fantastic. And yet, when you drop it into sixth gear, it does become civilized and livable in here again. It's not a complete animal all of the time. Typical of BMWs, the pedals are perfectly placed for heel and toe changes. So when you're slowing down for these corners on this fantastic bit of road, you can rev match and heel and toe as much as you like. While we're talking about the sound, this engine really is a masterpiece. BMW have always been famous for their straight six motors, and this one is absolutely no exception. It is a fantastic bit of kit to use. It's very responsive, it's got really nice linear power, it pulls strongly from low down in the revs, and it just keeps getting stronger the higher you go. It's exactly the kind of engine character that I love having in my sports car. It actually also, surprisingly enough, returns pretty good fuel economy. According to the trip computer on this car, I'm averaging around 9.2 liters per 100 kilometers, which for a 3-liter sports car that only really gets driven enthusiastically at weekends, that's really not bad. As I said in the introduction, this engine was replaced in 2006, at least for the South African market. In other markets, I believe the engine choice has changed slightly with the introduction of the 3-liter SI model and various other 3-liter specifications. But at least in South Africa, 2006 brought the 3-liter SI, which with it brought 195 kilowatts, some 25 kilowatts more than this engine from the same displacement. However, that engine used Vanos and various other bits of trickery to get to that extra power figure, and unfortunately that system has a terrible reputation for failing after a few years. So your cheap sports car can be used every day, it's comfortable enough to do so, and it actually brings you back reasonable fuel economy. But what about the other practicality aspects of it? Well, unfortunately in here there's not a hell of a lot of space. You've got a small cubby hole between the seats back here, and you've got another little bit of storage space in the glove box on the passenger side. Unfortunately, the door pockets are very small and shallow, and there aren't even any cup holders in here to hold your drink. So this really is a car that's good for weekends, but not particularly great to drive on a daily basis if it's going to be your only car. And I suspect that's probably how my car got to be 20 years old without really racking up a hell of a lot of mileage. I often get criticized for buying this car and not the 3.2 litre M version of the Z4. And to be honest, I've driven the M version, and yes, it is better than this. I will freely admit that the M version is a better car. But at the same time, I have to say that it is a better car in certain situations. For example, that S54 3.2 litre engine that's in the M version loves to rev. But if you don't rev it, it doesn't have nearly the torque that this engine does. Sure, far up the rev range, it's got all the torque you could ever want, but when you're just bumbling around behind a buffoon in a Daihatsu Terios, like I am, that engine lacks torque compared to this one. And for that reason, a lot of people have reported that in the real world, driving on real roads, this car's probably very nearly as fast as the M version. And I can completely see that. I can totally agree with that. But even that wasn't my main concern in choosing this one over the M version. In fact, my main concern was more to do with what it's going to cost me to keep this car running. Most of the mechanical parts on this car, from the suspension and drivetrain and even the electronics, are taken from a combination of the E90 3 Series and of course the E46, which means that most of the bits that are on this car that might ever need replacing are from one of the cars that BMW has produced more of than any other in their entire model lineup. So how can I conclude this test? Well, honestly, yes, you could say that I'm biased because I own one of these things, but I honestly don't think that there is very much that you can buy for 200,000 or less that could beat this. For the same sort of money, you could look at a Porsche Boxster, for example, which sounds like a great idea. But at this price point, you're going to be looking at the 2.7 or even the 2.5 litre model, and that's going to be disappointing because it just doesn't have the kind of power that you need to exploit that excellent chassis. And then I haven't even talked about the maintenance costs. There's something called Porsche tax for a reason. Every single thing that you are going to need to buy for that car is going to cost you a small fortune. Whereas, like I said, parts on this car are 3 Series money. The alternative is obviously the tried and tested roadster of the people, the Mazda MX-5. But at this price point, you would be looking at an NC at best, which is generally considered to be the worst MX-5 there ever was. Still a great car, but not very much loved by the community and not destined to be the cult classic that some of the others might be. Also, if you're going to be looking at an NC or even an NB, you'll be looking at a car with considerably more mileage on it than my Z4. And yes, you could probably get a Mercedes SLK for the same kind of money. But I've owned the most extreme version of the SLK 55 AMG, and I have to be honest, as a sports car, it's a little bit soft. So I can only imagine that the 350 and the rather lowly 200, which would actually fall into this car's price class, are probably not going to be great fun to drive. Whereas this car as a package is a lot more fun. It's a much more lighter and agile feeling thing than the SLK ever was. Another car you might be considering is the Toyota GT86. And again, I could speak with some authority on this because I did actually own one. And don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those guys who's going to tell you that the 86 is a crap car because it needs more power. Yes, it could probably handle more power, but I'm one of those people who believes that a sports car doesn't have to be fast to be good. And the 86 is not a fast car by any stretch of the imagination, which kind of makes it a one-trick pony. It's very good on a road like this where everything is very short, sharp bends and tight corners, very technical stuff. But on a road like Helswuchte, for example, where there's much more open, sweeping bends, the car just doesn't have enough power to really pull through those corners at any kind of speed that would really make it fun to drive.
What makes the Z4 such an attractive choice for me is the fact that it has that analog sports car feel that I'm after for my weekend driver, but at the same time it retains a little bit of refinement, sophistication, and even practicality, so that I can still use it on date nights. I can throw a couple of bags in the back of it and take it away for a weekend without having to worry about being uncomfortable and tired when I get to where I'm going.
So that's it for the BMW Z4, specifically my BMW Z4. I hope you guys enjoyed coming along for this ride. I certainly have enjoyed myself. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and if there's another car that you think I've forgotten about, please mention it in the comments. I'd love to know what you guys think is a good sports car for 200 grand that might even be better than this. Thanks guys, we'll see you for the next one.